Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Boruto 2 Blue Vortex manga chapter review. This one's going to be for chapter 19, Konohamaru-chan. So overall, I thought that this was an okay chapter. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion with this one about pacing, about did the 40 chapters deliver a month's worth of manga content, and I agree with that to a certain extent. I don't think this is one of the stronger chapters of 2 Blue Vortex, primarily because I think we got that kind of, classic thing with a lot of early parts of fights where it's the boring part of a fight where it is sort of just the characters checking out what each other can do. They're using their kind of basic moves. We're not getting ready quite yet to build up to the characters revealing their new moves and the final stages of fights. It's just the beginning. And that has to happen. It's a role player chapter in that sense on most regards. Though I do think there is one quite interesting scene, the Jura scene, where he talks about sort of like how they're dealing with the concept of love, I think is interesting, and I hope they're able to tackle that well as we go forward from a conceptual point with what the Divine Tree characters actually are. And potentially I hope that gets used as a bit of a pathway to what may or may not be the end kind of like weakness of these characters, that they're highlighting how humans and their kind of capacity for love is their weakness, and they're trying to avoid that while still gaining all the benefits of being intelligent and stuff like that. But have they missed the mark a little bit? And I think that's maybe what we're building towards. So that scene could end up being huge for the future in terms of explaining the ultimate failure of these characters. But for now, it's just a nice little extra thing in a chapter that I think otherwise, like most of the page count, is sort of just very by the numbers standard fighting and maybe a couple of fun back and forths to a certain degree. So let's get into the chapter page by page to discuss this in a bit more detail. Cover page is Moegi, just straight up Moegi. It's not Matsuri, it's Moegi, which I do appreciate that there, of just like, hey, I know she's trapped in the tree right now, but this is relevant to, you know, the Konohamaru situation here, because clearly this is where the actual real feelings, I guess, are, which will be interesting when we get to the end of this arc, and I guess the characters are freed from trees. Do they finally just do these relationships now that we kind of touched on a lot of these ideas? And because we're assuming Matsuri's feelings come from the fact that Moegi's trapped in the tree and she doesn't interpret what those feelings are or why she feels that way, but it's because Moegi feels that way, I guess. So fitting and nice to see. But we'll get into the actual chapter itself. So we actually start off with a flashback scene to explain the lodestone sealing sword that Araya has. And why does it have the ability to counter Shinki's abilities? I think Araya touched on this in the last chapter, that like they developed this together. Here is sort of the aftermath of that. That Shinki has infused the sword with his own chakra. And he basically says, if you use your wind-style sword jutsu, with this sword, you should be able to manipulate iron sand somewhat, similar to how he can. Araya points out that, are you sure you want to give this to me? Like a direct counter to your abilities. You know, I'll be better than you when we spar, basically. But he says, you know, give me a break. If anything, this will be the perfect handicap for me. And so they just kind of have a laugh about it. Then we get to, you know, basically, why did you do this? It's all for the purpose of protecting Father better. So Gaara. Shinki wants to protect Gaara. That's why I want to expand our powers as much as possible. Araya points out that Shinki talks a lot about Gaara, his adopted father. And he's just like, of course, what's wrong with that? And Araya says, you should pay Yodo some attention too. Clearly going with the idea that he's aware that I guess Yodo has feelings for Shinki. Shinki thinks about this, but then says, who's a hypocrite now? All you talk about is Yodo. And Araya doesn't really have anything to say. He thinks about Yodo. Then he says it's not like that, as we cut back to the present day. So this is an interesting part of this dynamic, where there seems to be a bit of a love triangle thing, I guess, within the Sand trio here, where, you know, what's the situation? Yodo likes Shinki, Araya likes Yodo, and you know, we don't know where things are actually going to kind of end up ultimately. So a bit of an interesting one, but it's notable. Kind of romance, love is a factor here, and it caused some issues to a certain degree, as we're maybe going to explore in a later scene. That why is Shinki the one in the tree and not Gaara? It's because Shinki sacrificed himself for his father. Why did the secret stealth kind of part of the mission to like assassinate Ryu not work? It's because Yodo kind of let her feelings get a little bit in the way, and she kind of messed up the stealth aspect of the mission by not being able to sort of turn off her kind of bloodlust. And that's just worth noting, that quite a few characters have a romance kind of love aspect to their plot, as I'll touch on as we kind of go through this. But anyway, into the present day fight, lodestone, sand sealing blade keeps getting used over and over here. It's the only thing that seems to be keeping them in the fight, because it's a direct counter to Ryu's abilities, which basically are Shinki's abilities. So he takes the lead here. He's like, Mitsuki, Sarada, you keep up the attacks. I'll take care of the iron sand. And basically Yodo immediately slips into being more of their sensory kind of part of their team. She directs Araya because she can hear the sand where it's coming from. That's how sensitive her hearing is. So she tells him exactly where the attacks are coming from, because if any of them get hit by it, they can then be controlled, and the fight's going to turn against them very quickly. So the duo of Yodo and Araya in this fight is very important here. So yeah, the fight begins. There's some pretty cool art, I think, of the sand getting used quite heavily. But yeah, the sword is countering it pretty perfectly up to now. We see that Yodo's like, incoming 7 o'clock. He reacts to this, dispels the sand pillar. Sarada comes in, fire style fireball jutsu. He blocks with a wall of sand. But that's just a feint, because Mitsuki comes in, wraps Ryu up in a snake kind of binding thing. He's in sage mode. Seems like they have him, but he basically dispels himself into sand. And this is kind of the big part of the fight here. This is why he's going to be a real challenge to deal with, is because he's able to like turn himself basically into the iron sand. And as we'll see as the fight progresses, even when they hit him, he can just turn that part of his body into the sand, so he doesn't really take the damage. So it's like, yeah, the dispelling sword is really, really important. That's why lodestone is so important. So this is where we get the other aspect of the sword. It's not just countering the sand, but also like the sand's just floating in the air. He uses it to sort of basically pull Ryu back together as like a physical kind of being. And he's like, whoa, what? The sword can also gather up the sand as well. And that's what Shinki said. It basically allows you to control it. Araya, I guess, has focused most of his techniques with it on just countering it, but he can also control it to a certain degree, which is interesting. This is where Mitsuki gets the attack in with the snakes, and it seems like they've got him. Sarada quickly activates her Sharingan and uses Chidori. Again, seems like it's a devastating blow, but he turns himself into sand again, and it's pointed out that, yeah, it was too shallow, and he just avoided the attack, basically. So yeah, they're going to track him down. They at least have a teamwork combo of everyone working together to actually do damage to him, so it seems relatively even ultimately. Next, we go back to Konohamaru and Matsuri, who are arguing. Interestingly, the kind of just the visuals of what's happening here, they're still sitting next to each other. It's just that Matsuri has her kind of cloak covering Konohamaru's head. So it's basically just this kind of almost like sphere of her cloak, and both of their heads are just right here, just screaming at each other. And it's just this argument, this quarrel, basically. I just want to call you Konohamaru-chan. What's the big deal? And Konohamaru says, I don't like it. It doesn't feel right. And yet, you let that wench, Moegi, call you that. It's so unfair. I can't change how I feel, and I shouldn't have to explain myself either. How can you be so selfish? Just let me call you what I want. You're the one being selfish. Why are you being so fussy over what to call me? You're a hypocrite. You're the picky one, Saratobi. And it's just this idea of Konohamaru could, I suppose, calm this down by just leaning into the acting a little bit more like he was before. But for whatever reason, just the pure heart, I guess, romantic that he is, he can't bring himself to sort of lie about these matters, which I think is the intent from the scene here. Is just that everyone would look at his actions in this scene and just be like, oh, Konohamaru, why can't you just like be a proper shinobi and kind of play her, basically? So he's going to get himself killed here, it looks like. Ada comments on this, and she says, I think the issue isn't what she wants to call you, so much as it is that you two don't share a relationship that allows it. But that's beyond you, isn't it, Konohamaru? So I think that's just a kind of oddly worded way of saying that, like, yeah, Konohamaru can't bring himself to feign the beginnings of a relationship with Matsuri to kind of keep the situation calm. They're just highlighting that, like, in a way, could there ever actually be a relationship between the two of them? It's not so much about, like, Konohamaru-chan as just the very concept of these two having to be close is almost like the issue really here. But she relays this to Kashin Koji and Boruto that, like, Konohamaru is basically about to get himself devoured. He's really annoyed Matsuri, and at the end, and she also relays what's going on in the other fight is that, like, hey, they're holding their own, but it's too early to tell how things will end. They can't help Konohamaru, so maybe Boruto, you should. But of course, he can't intervene because they don't want to draw Jura into the conflict, which is what Boruto basically will do. So Boruto's hindered from helping out. I really hope he doesn't have to help out because, like, this is not his fight. The whole point of the setup here of having so many villains and all these other characters involved is that they get their own fights, and it shouldn't be a requirement for Boruto to have to win all of the fights. I think that's an important distinction to keep, and I do hope this is just here to highlight that this is Boruto as the hero. He's not comfortable just staying back, but I don't think they should involve him in the fight yet. Then we switch to what I think is the most interesting aspect of this chapter. Jura is talking to Mamushi and Hidari, so these are the three that are still left in their kind of hideout, basically. And he basically gives them his speech on, I suppose, how they should handle their improving intelligence, and in a way, their evolution almost into being humans, that they really don't want to go all the way to being humans. They want to avoid some of the perceived weaknesses that humans have, and keep up the kind of type of being that they are at the moment, which is they're intelligent, but they're still Divine Tree characters, so they want their instincts to be sharp, and they want to be able to devour people without the feeling of their ties to other people getting in the way, and then especially love getting in the way. This is what this 2-page spread is all about. It's, you know, the other thing we have to deal with, it's going to be challenging, is love. So the way he words this in particular is that he says that, in my opinion, life forms should obey their instincts to strive towards the goal known as evolution. Yet, because of their social nature, humans bind themselves with restraints called reasoning, dulling that instinct, which I think is quite an interesting one with regards to, they want to keep some of that, like, beast aspect of themselves, but they do appreciate the intelligence, but they don't want to get so intelligent that they move past their instincts, keeping them sharp. He says it's a harmful side effect of acquiring intelligence, and it's why humankind carries a fatal flaw. I'm wondering if the translator just left in two words they were considering to use here. It's why humankind faces a fatal flaw. It's why humankind carries a fatal flaw. I don't think you need both of those words here, so that's kind of an interesting one. I assume that's an error. Unlike us Divine Trees, who would stay true to our instincts. Mamushi is like, poor humans, but it's got nothing to do with us. Not so fast. For that isn't the only harmful effect of intelligence. This other concept carries with it the risk of causing us, even us Divine Trees, serious problems. It's called love. Which, obviously, what this chapter is directly highlighting is that, well, Matsuri is very directly dealing with this, the feelings of love. The question sort of comes up is, well, what about the other ones? we haven't really covered a lot of the details with them necessarily. They clearly haven't really brought that into play just yet. And I think especially, what's Jura dealing with that relates to love? Because you can sort of maybe figure it out with some of the other characters where, okay, with Matsuri, there's clearly the sense of just romantic attraction type thing, a relationship. That's what they're going for there, because that's potentially the Moegi Konohamaru dynamic. With Hidari, potentially in the future, what we might get to, given that this is a concept being introduced, is that will deal with the kind of parental, kind of familial love, because Sasuke is Sarada's father and Hidari's target is Sarada. When that gets brought up in front of Hidari, how's he going to feel about that? So far, it doesn't seem like that's really in play, but now that he knows what the concept kind of is, the next meeting between those two might be quite interesting. My impression of the kind of Bug/Mamushi situation is that might deal with kind of almost like obsessive love almost, because Ada's kind of creeped out by the whole he can see her type situation, and I got the impression maybe with Bug is that he was kind of a bit obsessed with her. We'll see what they do there, because that's probably the most underdeveloped one so far, I think. But then Jura, because he's not based on anyone, he basically just is the individual, like, Ten Tails himself. What problem is he going to face that's caused by love? The only thing I can think of right now is just that, like, he really reads all the books. They have already kind of highlighted he has a sort of attachment to the village. He's not going to just destroy it unless he's greatly enraged. So is he sort of attached to humans, kind of art forms to a certain degree? Like, he hates what humans are to a certain degree, but also is fundamentally attached to what they have added to the world. Something like that. That to a certain degree, what's happening here is he's the one maybe who is actually becoming more and more human, and is fighting back against it stronger than the others, but actually he probably should just go with it. It's an interesting one with him because he is so mysterious while, you know, also being the main villain. But I think very clearly this conversation is probably going to be something we have to maybe refer back to a lot as we go forward in terms of how these characters will change and evolve compared to what they want to do. And I definitely think there's going to be some interesting stuff that happens in the future with this. But anyway, we do cut over to Matsuri and Konohamaru. She says, "My head is so full of thoughts about you, it's driving me batty. Why do I have these feelings? It's so painful and makes me crazy mad." Konohamaru says, "Calm down." And she's like, "Yeah, that's precisely why. Because if I devoured you, I wouldn't ever have to feel this way again." So that's her thoughts on this, is if she devours her target, then surely her feelings will go away, right? But then there's the idea of, we don't really know what that dynamic is. Like, what actually happens when one of these people devours their target? It's not really clear. Because this is different than the typical divine tree thing, where they want to devour an Otsutsuki and they become a divine tree. In this case, like, what actually happens here? Because if she kills Konohamaru, like, I'm guessing she would actually feel sad, but not understand why she feels sad. Maybe there's some weird thing of, like, because she has devoured him, like, it creates some sort of a thing where, like, his feelings become part of her feelings, and it actually does fix her problem. But my guess is that Matsuri's logic here is not correct, because they don't understand love. They view it as, if I kill the person I care about, that gets rid of it. The feelings, right? No. And it's interesting that that's half a page, and then we cut straight back to Jura further explaining with more, you know, personal kind of matters here. Each of the Ino, Shika, Cho trio are accomplished shinobi, but they prioritized Himawari's safety over their own teams. What's shocking is that they were all aware of how foolish that decision was. So he noted that, and in particular, Yamanaka Inojin lost his composure and ended up needlessly losing his life. Both of these foolish acts were caused by love derailing their thinking. And then Hidari points out, so what is this love thing? Is it a disease? Jura then points out the term itself appears in many tomes, so like books and stuff like that, but it seems impossible to pin down. I was like, really? At the very least, the fact that it can cause serious trouble in life forms cannot be overlooked. As we cut back to, it's just a visual cutaway to Konohamaru and Matsuri, kind of highlighting that, like, well, here's a problem directly happening right now. One of our own is dealing with this super directly. I'm sure you hear it too. Our instincts screaming in warning that we must understand this dangerous concept, love, and overcome it. And it's very interesting that this is sort of their new goal to a certain degree, is we need to evolve, but evolve in the right way. And we need to be very careful about love in particular, because this might, I suppose, change us in the wrong way. Again, I think there is a pathway for some of these characters where I think you get maybe what they're going to go for with it. But again, with Jura, I'm not really sure what, like, him and love necessarily is. That's quite interesting, because he's clearly lost in thought that he doesn't understand what happened with, like, why he didn't get Himawari, why the others saved her, knowing that they really didn't stand a chance. So that idea of, like, self-sacrifice because you care is really not present within these characters, highlighting that they're probably highly unlikely to help each other out, rush to each other's aid or anything like that. Because again, do they in any way care about each other? Other than maybe just, I need other people to fulfill my goals, do they actually care? And how do they feel about each other? It's an interesting concept, I think, because definitely the takeaway from this is that there's an element of survival of the fittest. They want to keep that almost like beast-like sharpness here. So Jura, it feels like, would only be drawn into a fight just because, oh, Boruto's come out of hiding, I want to face Boruto, not to save whoever Boruto's going up against, but surely just because the guy I want to face is there. So it does feel like a kind of way to manipulate them to a certain degree, so we'll see what happens. But anyway, we cut back to the fight with Ryu against the shinobi, of course. And yeah, he's up in the sky. We get an almost repeat of what was about to happen, which is Araya using the sword to kind of almost like drag Ryu back together so they can actually hit him. But then all of a sudden, claw grimes come out of Ryu's coat, because his coat is basically a giant claw mark, of course. So the claw grimes spill out. Everyone jumps into action, but they're temporarily overwhelmed here. They're really surprised by the sudden kind of numbers difference. Yodo does get bitten on the shoulder. Araya jumps in to save her. It is unclear if, like, kind of, I suppose, blood has been drawn, if this is a proper, like, she's actually been bitten to the point where she's going to turn into a tree, or it's just like this came really close, like he was just about to bite through her clothing but he didn't actually get through her skin. That's obviously going to be something that has to be revealed, I guess, in the next chapter. So Araya rushes in and doesn't maybe protect the sword as much as he needs to, so he basically cuts far enough into it where he almost cuts into one of the actual claw marks. And in the middle of all the chaos, Ryu grabs the claw grime that the sword is now in and uses this to basically, like, transfer the guy with the sword stuck in him into one of the other claw marks. So Araya loses his sword into a claw mark at this point. So the big ending of this stage of the story is that now they have to fight Ryu without the thing that was keeping them in the fight. Otherwise, it seems like he's now going to steamroll them, because something maybe has happened to Yodo here, and who knows what Araya is able to do without the sword. So it kind of puts the pressure a little bit maybe more on Mitsuki Sarada going forward in this fight. I'll discuss that in a minute. But that's the kind of cliffhanger ending, is that the perfect counter to Ryu is now gone. What's next? The actual final page of the chapter is Matsuri moves to fully devour Konohamaru. So she's obviously trapped his face in her kind of cloak thing, and now it's kind of zooming in, covering his entire face. She says, now let's become one. Konohamaru-chan. So it seems like the only thing that's going to stop Konohamaru being devoured is if someone intervenes, or if she can't bring herself to actually, quote unquote, devour him when it really comes down to it. Like, what are her feelings as she's doing this? Is that this is the contrast. She wants to target him as her person to devour for a reason, but then she also clearly loves him, but she doesn't understand that. And it's going to be an interesting kind of point here, which way they go with it. I'm kind of inclined, based on this chapter, to believe that they will highlight the weakness of she actually just initially can't do it. And so Konohamaru is going to get like a chance to talk again, recompose himself or something like that. Because I think that's probably the more interesting avenue of storytelling to do, is that this continues as a kind of interesting one-on-one back and forth that's not quite a fight. Whereas on the other side of the story, you have just a full-on fight happening. But we'll see what exactly happens, because I think it would be a little bit boring if they just had Boruto quickly come in to save Konohamaru, and that's all we do there. I think Konohamaru needs this kind of spotlight here, and I'm fascinated to see what happens next, because I don't think he's going to get devoured here. I get to a certain degree we kind of need to know what happens maybe when one of them does get devoured, but I'm not sure this is the right character to do that with necessarily. So that's also worth noting. But yeah, that is the end of the chapter. And again, like, I think as I've went through it there, you can see it's not that there's nothing here. It's just, I think, not on the higher end of chapters that we've had. And it is probably among one of the weaker ones, just in terms of what actually happened. I think a lot depends on how much you read or don't read into, how much you like the idea of this, like, how the Divine Tree characters are dealing with basically emotions, and specifically love, as a plot point. I think it's sort of interesting because clearly this is a thing that they're trying to compare and contrast, is that clearly on the human side of things, you have like Konohamaru, you have like Shinki, Yodo, Araya dealing with it. Even the Sarada Sumire thing over Boruto is a plot about love. Ada, her plot, let's not forget, is also about love to a certain degree, and that's why she always seems to be included in a lot of the relationship drama stuff, because she's almost like gaining experience of actual relationships by looking at these things happening here. So a lot of that stuff, I think, is actually kind of quite interesting and intriguing. So they're doing that, but then they're also beginning to bring into play that, I guess they actually are going to have some sort of a, like, these characters are all going to have some sort of flaw that comes into play, because it's not just their intelligence that's developing, they're also developing emotions, and they don't know how to deal with them. And so they seem to be leaning in the love direction, and we'll see how it goes for each of the individual characters and what flaw that potentially creates here. And I think that's why the next stage of the Matsuri Konohamaru situation is going to be fascinating to see what they do. Is it someone interferes, or does she stop? Because if she stops, that becomes very interesting for the character. But otherwise, yeah, a little bit frustrating that like the Amado Kawaki plot is very much getting dragged out a little bit, where like something will happen, it's not in the next chapter, then the next stage of things happen, then it's not in the next chapter. Whereas there's some actual really, really interesting stuff happening over there. But as for the big fight, the Ryu fight, okay, I appreciated what they did here in that ultimately it allowed the kind of teamwork of Araya and Yodo to allow them to stay in the fight quite comfortably, and they nearly got him. Like, they had it in a position where they were evenly matched against him. It didn't seem like they necessarily had a pathway to victory fully in terms of what's actually going to do damage to him, but it was an even aspect of the fight. Now, without the Lodestone Sword, it seems like they don't have any obvious counter to what's going on, because if any of them get sand on them, suddenly Ryu's going to be able to control them. Yodo maybe is out of the fight. We don't know what tools Araya has now that he has lost his sword. So again, like I said, the pressure comes on Mitsuki and Sarada to stand up. I don't think we've had any clear setup for some power advancement necessarily for Mitsuki necessarily. So it does feel like this kind of has to be the moment for Sarada to show herself. Mainly when it comes to Mangekyo Sharingan. That's, I think, really the only power-up that like really works in this case, where that is a suddenly super high-level power, and that seems like something that might actually be able to win the day. Now, are they going to do that? It feels like they have to do a lot of setup work to get there in terms of explaining how she learned to train it, what the ability actually is. Is she going to use one of the more standard Mangekyo techniques, or her new signature one if she has one? Because that seems to be the way they go with it, is that everyone who has the Mangekyo kind of has their own unique ability to go along with the unique pattern. Is that the approach? We just don't know at this point, but that seems to finally be the situation where, like, surely there's no way they get away out of this situation without her revealing more of her kind of moveset going forward. That maybe Kakashi has trained her in secret, we just haven't heard about it yet. She has to step into the spotlight. It's perfectly set up to do that. The Yodo being bitten thing I find to be quite interesting because it's highlighted visually, but no one has called it out yet in like dialogue necessarily. Okay, Araya's rushing to help her out, but they've yet to sort of surface it in a way properly within the story just yet, that she might be about to turn into a tree, and what does that mean? And then, like, does this mean that there's now the capacity for another Divine Tree character to come into play? I feel that's almost overcomplicating things, but we'll see what happens. Maybe the fact that the person who bit her got immediately, like, stabbed and then sent away means it's not a thing. Like whatever it was planning to do, it didn't finish the job. We'll see, but there are my thoughts there. So there are my thoughts overall on chapter 19 of Two Blue Vortex. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the chapter, especially the Jura love stuff. Like, how big of a deal do you think that actually is, and what do you think is going to happen next? I didn't get a chance to do a speculation video ahead of this chapter, just with other videos to do. We'll see how I feel in regards to, will I do a speculation video for the next chapter, just because, you know, it feels like it's just next stage of fights might already be covered, but we'll see what happens. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.